Right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. This webinar, Bringing HIV is Not a Crime, or HINAC, to Cuyahoga County. We appreciate you all joining us. If you would introduce yourself in the chat box with your name, pronouns, and where you're from, we would appreciate that. Next slide, please. This meeting is being recorded. It will be shared on the HINAC YouTube channel, and hopefully we can get it up on OHMM's YouTube or website as well. We do ask that everyone keep yourself on mute unless you are speaking. Please put your questions in the chat box. We will answer them at the end of the presentation. And we would like to do a huge shout out and thank you to the AIDS Funding Collaborative for funding this project. Next. Oh, I'm sorry. So it's the Center for Community Solutions. Sorry. So I'm Tammy Haught, co-executive director of the CERO project, and I use she, they pronouns. And I'm just going to be moderating this conversation. I'm going to announce our three presenters and give them a minute to introduce themselves. So today we'll be hearing from Bryan C. Jones, Antonio Elmore, and Siyahni-White. So Bryan, you want to kick off with introductions, please?
Hi, my name is Bryan C. Jones. I'm a person who's been thriving with an AIDS diagnosis for going into my 41st year. Can you believe that? I know I only look 26, but anyway, I've been involved in the criminalization space since 2009 after attending a United States conference on HIV and AIDS. I heard a presentation, and I guess I'm considered the grandfather when it comes to modernizing our law here in Ohio for getting the conversation started. I have an organization called the Sankofa HIV Initiative, which is a totally peer-led model that deals with, we give healing weekends for people living with HIV. We also do trainings and educational sessions, not just for people living with HIV, but also for providers. I'm also responsible for an initiative, a prevention method called DIRT advocacy, and DIRT is an acronym for direct, inspiring, reachable, and teachable. It's a conversation for Black people in Black communities that look like us, live like us, and talk like us. So I'll pass it on to Siyahni. Siyahni, da-da.
Sorry. Hi, my name is Siyahni. I'm just an advocate. Hold on for a second.
Are you doing the catwalk for us, Siyahni?
No, I'm sorry. I have roommates. I meant to tell them that I was doing the important Zoom call. I apologize for that.
That's quite all right.
My name is Siyahni. I don't know how to follow up with that, but I advocate for trans rights, for Black African-American women's rights, and that's about it.
That's enough. That's more than enough. Tony, Antonio, you're on mute. Unmute yourself, sir.
Yeah. Didn't they say somebody put a message on Facebook saying that they finally found a place?
Tina, you're not on mute. There we go. There we go.
Tony, you're on mute.
No, I'm not.
Oh, okay.
My name is Tony. I've been living with the diagnosis for 31 years. I recently got involved with the Sankofa HIV Initiative within the last year and a half, after living 30 years with no support. I am a member, recently a member of the Ohio Health Modernization Movement. I will go through my first training this Saturday. I am also a member of the We Think for a Change, a community-based organization serving people living with HIV.
Thank you to the three of you. I'm just going to briefly explain in a couple of slides what HINAC is, along with HIV criminalization and how it impacts people living with HIV, while leaving the majority of our time together to hear from Bryan, Tony, and Siyahni on how HIV criminalization impacts their lives. So next slide, please. So the SARO project produces HINAC, HIV is Not a Crime National Training Academy, in partnership with the Positive Women's Network USA, Positively Trans, Thrive SS, and the U.S. People Living with HIV Caucus, all national networks of people living with HIV, as well as in coalition with a large number of national, state, and local people living with HIV, LGBTQ plus IA, racial, gender, economic, and social justice organizations. It is a biannual event, and the last one, HINAC 5, was hosted in 2023 in Emory, Virginia, and so the next HINAC will be in 2025. HINAC supports intentional and proactive involvement of community activists and people living with HIV networks as part of a larger agenda to end disproportionate policing and incarceration of communities of color, trans and non-binary, gender non-conforming individuals, sex workers, and substance users. Next slide, please. HIV criminalization is the wrongful use of HIV status in a criminal prosecution, whether it is under HIV-specific statutes that exist in 30 states or under general criminal statutes for HIV exposure or transmission through consensual sex, needle sharing, or through spitting and biting. Failure to disclose, reckless exposure, or intent to transmit, aggravated assault, aggravated sexual assault, or attempted murder have also been some charges that people have faced, especially in states that do not have HIV-specific laws. The prosecutors have the discretion to charge under any general criminal statute. Next slide, please. HIV criminalization, most of the laws only require that the person knows his or her HIV status for a successful prosecution. Knowledge of a status is used often as intent to transmit. Prosecutions occur even when transmission is unlikely or impossible, such as the use of a condom. A person living with HIV had an undetectable viral load, or the behavior posed no risk of HIV transmission, such as biting, scratching, and spitting. However, when these laws were put on the books, science didn't really matter. They were adopted based on fear and stigma, which is, one of the arguments that we use on why these laws need to be reformed, repealed, and modernized. So HIV criminalization has led to people living with HIV being vilified in the media and privacy rights violated. Often the headline is just sensationalized, and people have had their HIV status in those headlines, along with, in some states, their address has even been printed. Sentences are disproportionate to the alleged offense, such as spitting. A gentleman in Texas got an additional 35 years added to his sentence for spitting at a correctional officer, while we know that there is zero risk of transmission through spitting. And in some states, some individuals are required to register as sex offenders. Next slide, please. So some of the impacts of HIV criminalization are it alienates patients from healthcare providers. In Iowa, when we were modernizing our law, we got one of our infectious disease doctors to provide a statement that was read during the testimony portion, and saying how patients aren't secure with telling their doctors their entire sexual history or anything that is going on, for fear that their records would be used against them in a criminal prosecution. These laws stigmatize all people living with HIV. They may encourage non-disclosure, inaccurate message regarding prevention responsibility. With these laws, the onus is put on people living with HIV rather than everyone being responsible for their own sexual health. Does not deter targeted behavior, and disproportionately affects marginalized communities, and disincentive to testing. So if you are unaware of your status, you cannot be charged. Next slide, please. And I'm going to hand it over to Bryan at this point.
Hi, everyone. I want to thank the Center for HIV Law and Policy for providing us with this map of the U.S. We understand that 30 states have HIV-specific laws, and actually 25 of these states have prosecuted under HIV-specific laws or general laws, which are more stringent, such as attempted murder. We've had weapons of mass destruction, biohazardous waste. All these laws have prosecuted people living with HIV. If we look at this map, it has various degrees and various understandings of how these laws have been used. We see that 25 states have prosecuted under HIV-specific laws, and there is an overlap here. We know that 9 states have sentencing enhancement laws, meaning that if you're a person living with HIV, you may be prosecuted under sex work. But if you have an HIV diagnosis, that instead of it being maybe a misdemeanor, it now becomes a felony. And in Ohio, ours goes to a 3rd-degree felony, which is carries a hefty weight when prosecuting people. We also see that 6 states have laws that may require you to register as a sex offender, and Ohio being one of those states. And this impacts people's lives, people living with HIV in a major way, because we know as registering as a sex offender, there is hardly anywhere you can actually live without other people knowing your status and that kind of thing. These laws have impacted us in a major way in terms of Ohio, as well as the states. We know that 13 states, and we say modernize our laws instead of, in a perfect world, we would say repeal these laws. But it's better to repeal and replace, because if we repeal these laws, that does not mean that a person would not be prosecuted under more stringent laws. We see a perfect example of this as Texas being the first state in the mid-90s to repeal their law, but continue to prosecute under very stringent general laws. So repealing is not necessarily the best fit. Like I say, 13 states have actually begun to modernize their law. And that a lot of that is attributed to HINAC, HIV is Not a Crime Training Academy, because it gave people the tools in which to go back to their states and modernize these laws. We have coalitions in each state that have worked overtime to modernize these laws. We can look at some examples of the best modernization. North Carolina modernized their law through their health codes, because a lot of states, such as Ohio, have health codes that address intentional transmission of any sexually transmitted infection. So North Carolina prosecuted under their health code. So they modernized their health codes. Also, if we look at Michigan, they modernized their laws under viral load. If you're undetectable, you don't have to disclose your status. There are various other examples. I think the rest of the criminalization community is looking at Illinois, who has modernized their laws twice, but the most recent modernization has been, they totally repealed their laws. So all eyes are on Illinois to see if they continue to prosecute under general laws. And the best example of these modernization of the laws is California, because California has made it almost impossible to prove intent. These laws are based on something called mens res, which is intent. In California, even if you did not use a condom, were not on ARVs or medication to suppress your viral load, they still have to prove that you intentionally tried to transmit HIV. And we know that people living with HIV are not trying to intentionally transmit the virus. We understand that with the coming of U equals U, which is undetectable equals untransmittable, that people living with HIV, many of us are doing our part to not transmit HIV. So it is definitely not our intent to transmit the virus. Although these laws are supposed to protect the public, there's no evidence that exists where it protects the public. So with that being said, we understand now that viral suppression is proof that we are people, as people living with HIV, are definitely doing our part to be a part of this movement. We also know that 6 laws have those sexual enhancements of you having to register as a sex offender. And I meant to say 9 states have these enhancement laws. So with that being said, I'm gonna pass it back to Tammy. I hope I didn't miss anything, but here we go.
No, thank you so much of that overview. This map is so important for people living with HIV to know their status or to know what the law is in case they travel to one of these states. So thank you for breaking it down, Bryan. And next slide. Now we're going on to the main event, and I will be asking the 3 presenters a few questions to start the conversation. So, Bryan, I love all of these pictures of you at various HINACs, and you have attended several HINACs. What does HINAC mean to you?
Well, HINAC gave me, it boasted my self-esteem in terms of realizing that I can be a part of the solution. As someone who's been living with a diagnosis for going into my 41st year, I always knew that I had to do something. And attending HINAC made me realize that there was a whole coalition of people working to change the stigma, working to change how we're perceived by other people. Even though HINAC is about modernizing our criminalization laws, HINAC is about so much more, because it gives you self-confidence, it gives you the self-esteem that was once taken away. It brings you out of isolation and realizing that there's another network of people who can help you do the work that you're doing. It gave me the tools and to be able to realize that I can fine-tune my voice, fine-tune what's known as advocacy, because a lot of times we do things that we don't realize is advocacy, just by talking to our peers, helping our peers. So it gave me these tools to go back and have conversations with legislators. But more importantly, it gave me the tools to help my peers and giving them confidence that we as a community are stronger together than we are separately. So HINAC made me realize that there was a whole group of people out there that I can connect with. And it gave me the tools to move forward and to be able to fight. It only takes one person. It only takes one person to make a difference. And I was that one person when it came to Ohio, because after attending a training, a conference, USCA, and I heard a conversation about criminalization laws, I kind of heard of these laws, but I didn't realize that people were actually being prosecuted. So I came back to my state and started having these conversations, and I fought, and then HIV is not a crime popped up on my email, and I was like, wow. I went to my first one, and it was so moving and so impactful because people were in various states, sat at different tables, and just to look around the room, you saw all these people from different states working together to try to make a difference. So it gave me that confidence that I needed to say, hey, it may only be me right now, but I can bring other people into the folds. And as a result of that, other people from Ohio have made it to HINAC. And it's just a wonderful thing to see our state blossom, and not just blossom with just confidence, but with also educational tools and being able to speak as a learned person about these laws. So thank you, Tammy.
Thank you, Bryan. That as a key planner, that means a lot that HINAC has brought that to you, and knowing that you have also taken the things that you've learned at HINAC and brought it back to your state, brought it back to your community to bring more people to the table. So thank you for all that you do with the information that you gain from attending. Next slide, please. I'm going to go to Tony, who this was HINAC 5 in 2023, was your first year attending. What was your experience like, or what stood out to you?
I had a lot of mixed emotions. I was energized. I was excited, but I was also scared because of just learning about HIV having laws a little over a year and a half ago and living with it for 31 years frightened me. The thing that stood out most to me was actually seeing people who had been incarcerated because of HIV laws. I never expected anything like that. That frightened me. It frightened me, but it also made me want to get busy in making a difference, being part of making a difference. It was a lot of knowledgeable information. I'm still processing. That's how much information it was, but I really enjoyed it. I met a lot of nice people, and I look forward to attending again.
Thank you so much, Tony. And I love the painting that you did. That turned out great. So we provide all those educational opportunities, but we also tried, and our partner organizations provided different fun activities to release some of the tension from some of the heavy conversations that we have. So you did a great job, and thank you for sharing your experience. If we go to the next slide, Siyahni, you have not attended HINAC. However, advocacy is a part of your everyday life. For some people, they haven't gotten into advocacy or not sure how to get started. How did you first become an advocate? What were some of the first things that you advocated for?
I did a couple of seminars before and speaking about HIV in a couple of seminars, because even me being 25 and been living with HIV for 3 years, I never knew anything about these laws. I never knew anything about this, and doing stuff like this is making me aware. That will also help make other people aware. So talking about my life and talking about the things I go through, it helps people understand that we're normal people. We're not here trying to hurt nobody. We're just living our best lives. And like you equals you, which means undetectable and equals untransmittable. Things like that. Like, these laws are outrageous. All of these things are very outrageous, and it scares me a little bit, but it also makes me aware. So now that I know what I can do about those things.
Thank you so much, Siyahni. And I think, especially Tony and Siyahni, you both shared how long you've been living with HIV before you learned about these laws being on the books. And it just shows how important these conversations are to educate the community, but also, where the failure is, because that also puts you at risk of criminalization. Tony for 30 years, Siyahni for 3 years. So, and I think I will can safely say this, Bryan, a lot of it comes from your education and your outreach to the community, and how important it is to take information that we learn at conferences like HINAC back to the community. So thank you all for that. Next slide, please. This question is for all of you, or any one of you who would like to answer. Personally, how has the law in Ohio impacted you directly or indirectly?
Well, me trying to give those. I first want to say I'm so proud of Tony and Siyahni being young people, even though Tony is diagnosed over 31 years. And from my perspective, he's still a young person when it comes to stepping out, because we know that it's hard to step out and advocate about these criminalization laws, because we never know if our past is going to jump out and bite us in the ass, so to speak. So it takes a lot of courage to step out in front. But I also say that if people living with HIV cannot have to step out on faith to say, because if we are trying to convince legislators and other people that these laws are wrong, we first got to step out and be a group of people saying that these laws are wrong. Because if we can't convince ourselves that these laws are wrong, then how can we convince others that these laws need to change? And unfortunately, a lot of people in Ohio are hiding because they're afraid. These laws have personally impacted my life because I have been personally blackmailed by people saying that if you can't provide me a space to come live with you, I'm going to tell the police that we had sex and you transmitted HIV to me. And I said, well, go ahead, because I'm as open about my status as anybody. But that does not mean that your life can be turned upside down. I've seen headlines, and this is just just an analogy. A man steals hamburgers from supermarket living with HIV. What does him shoplifting have to do with HIV? And we know that it continues to put us at risk. It continues to put us at risk for danger. Now, the government can't have it both ways. On one hand, you say that HIV is a chronic, manageable condition, and when it comes to giving us health care, but on the other hand, when it comes to prosecuting us, you say we hand down a death sentence. It's either chronic and manageable or it's a death sentence. You can't continue to deny us health care or deny us other services and then prosecute us in the same vein. We're either going to treat HIV or prosecute HIV. We can't have it both ways. And unfortunately, in Ohio, I have seen it detrimental to people. And whether we know it or not, we know that the science has come a long way, but people are still living in silence and people are still dying in silence as a result of these laws. So that's how they impact me.
Thank you, Bryan. And that is so true. We can either prosecute people living with HIV or we could try to end the epidemic. We can't do both while we cannot end the epidemic until these laws change, until people feel safe to get tested and in treatment. So thank you so much for that and for sharing your personal experience that I'm sure many, many people living with HIV have also experienced. Tony or Siyahni, is there anything that you want to add on how finding out about these laws, how it has impacted you directly or indirectly?
Yes, I'd like to share. It has actually changed my life. Not that I had the greatest life before, but what it's done is it's made me more aware. And it's just, it's made me be more careful, a lot more careful. Like I said, I just learned about them a little over a year and a half ago. So I think about my past, not that I was crazy out there, but just the fact that I was living without knowing is frightening.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tony.
Now I want to become a part of the solution and not the problem.
Thank you.
And man, you said that, it made me think that it puts us in our mind that we are a problem, but we really aren't. We're doing what everyone has a right to do, the right to a healthy sex life. And there's something called the Denver Principle that said we condemn attempts to be labeled a victim, a term which implies defeat. And we are only occasionally a patient, a term which implies passivity and dependent upon the care of others. We're people living with AIDS. It talks about how we have a right to serve on legislative boards and these things that impact our life. It says we have a right to live and die in dignity. People aren't living in dignity because of these laws. And certainly at that time, when these laws were enacted in 1983, people weren't able to die in dignity because funeral homes wouldn't accept their bodies. But it also says, when they were compiled in 1983, that we have a right to a healthy sex life. That's something that everyone has a right to do freely. And us being people living with HIV are constantly being ostracized for doing something which comes naturally to everyone else. And so it doesn't allow us to live full and honest lives. And we constantly, the stigma allows us to think that we're a problem or that we're not worthy, and we beat up on ourselves. So go ahead, I'm sorry.
Bryan, let me clarify what I said. When I said problem, I was actually talking about the laws that have been made up. Okay, not us as people.
Mm-hmm. But a lot of people do think that we're a problem. And for years, I couldn't admit to myself in a room by myself that I had HIV. I had AIDS then, because that's what it was then. And so I thought for years that I was the problem. I looked at myself as being patient zero, so to speak, because, and when I learned about these laws, it also caused me to further compile all this stuff on my shoulders. But by attending HINAC, all this was lifted off me because I realized that I was the only person who was living like that and feeling like that. And it gave me the strength to say that I am not the problem, that we are not the problem, and we're going to work hard to change these things.
Thank you both so much. We are not the problem. Stigma and these laws play so much of a role in our lives to keep us quiet or silenced. And just want to give an opportunity to Siyahni if there was anything that you wanted to add, but no pressure, knowing that you're newly diagnosed and newly found out about these laws. You may not have had time to process exactly the impact that it has.
Correct. You said it all. I actually have it. So no, I don't have anything to add on to that one.
Right. Thank you so much. So Bryan is going to share some information about the Ohio Health Modernization Movement and also about Sankofa and the laws in Ohio for people who aren't aware of what is happening in the state. So Bryan, I'm going to turn it over to you.
So as you see, Ohio has 6 statutes that they prosecute under. The felonious law assault statute, got a little tongue-tied there. There's solicitation after receiving a diagnosis. There's loitering to engage in solicitation. And a lot of times we find that our trans community is being targeted, and those same gender loving or LGBTQ folks are being targeted because there's certain areas of town that are more LGBTQ friendly. And if I'm walking along the streets and I see a friend of mine pass by and I waved at them, the police can stop, detain me based on the fact that they're saying that I'm loitering after receiving a diagnosis. How am I loitering when I'm just trying to get from point A to point B? A lot of times you may have had a history of sex work, but have changed your life, and you may be doing outreach at the gay clubs or bars. If you're found with more than 2 condoms on your person, that is reason to stop you, detain you, and possibly try to charge you, hype up the charges. And as we know in our legal system that people plea bargain out, we can't track whether people are being prosecuted under these HIV specific statutes. If they were detained under that, and then they plea bargain, they force you to plea bargain to a lesser charge, which also puts self-stigma on us. The other solicitation is prostitution, and solicitation and prostitution may seem like the same thing, but they're 2 different things. Our sex workers are constantly being harassed and prosecuted, whether you're engaging in sex work or not. We've got to understand that sex work is a legitimate space for people. And we're fighting around the country to try to change the perception of that. Harassment with a bodily substance or bodily fluid, selling or donating contaminated blood. We also know that the blood is being screened anyway. So there's no risk of you donating it and transmitting it to transmitting HIV to anyone else. But people are still being prosecuted with this. In Ohio, our laws used to say that before you kiss someone, you used to have to disclose your status. But they changed that law, and now it says before you use a toy on someone, you have to disclose your status. It talks about inserting anything into any orifice. So I don't know if I lick my finger and stick it in your ear, can I be prosecuted because of that? These laws are vague for a purpose. They're not about transmission. It's simply about the fact that you did not disclose your status. And there's no way to really prove you disclose your status short of taking someone to your doctor's appointment. But I also learned from young people that through Sankofa, through our healing weekend, young people are saying now that they're sharing their My Chart with people. And the My Chart is your health record. They're sharing their My Chart with people where a person can see that they are a person living with, and they log in to their My Chart. It's proof that they had access to their health record. And some people say, well, they can share it with someone else. That person, only the person who you shared it with can access it. So they can't share it with someone else further. But I found that this was monumental information that I learned from young people who attend Sankofa. And it's a perfect segue into Sankofa. Sankofa, like I stated earlier, is a PLHIV model implemented, developed, and carried out by people living with HIV. We bring people into these safe spaces of being totally around people who all have a diagnosis. For many people who come to Sankofa, they've never been in that space, and they never realize how powerful it is, that your diagnosis is not just negative. It can be positive, all puns intended, because you're around people who can help educate each other and share information that will impact our lives. And I don't know if this leads into talking about the Ohio Health Modernization Movement, but the Ohio Health Modernization Movement, through our efforts, it's a coalition dedicated to modernizing our laws here in Ohio. And we also deal with other health disparities too, that deal with the intersection of HIV criminalization laws. We welcome anyone, be you a person living with or a person who has a negative diagnosis, because we all have a status. We welcome everybody to the table. And for those people living with HIV, you can do as much or as little as you want. Talking about and educating around these laws does not mean, it's not about disclosing your status, because you can do this work without disclosing your status. We need people in the background, but we also need people in the forefront. And I wasn't always a person who was in the forefront. Can you believe that? I know y'all find that hard to believe, that I was also a person hiding in fear. I call it the Anne Frank syndrome, where I was hiding, waiting for somebody to discover me and possibly do bodily harm to me. Excuse me. The Ohio Health Modernization Movement is important to me because I have seen the positive side, like I said, all puns intended, of living with a diagnosis, and I have seen the negative side. When I first started advocating, I went to a university and I was hit over the head with a tire iron after leaving, which had staples in the back of my head. I also, and I get a little choked up, but I don't have waterproof mascara, so I'm not gonna start crying right now. But I also shared my status with someone, and I had my car set on fire in my yard and it burned to a crisp. And I hadn't done anything. I hadn't even held hands with this person. So these laws impact us in a major way. And so I encourage other people to do something with the Ohio Health Modernization Movement, because it changed my life. It made me realize that I'm not a problem, that I can do something small, such as stuffing envelopes or passing out literature or having conversations with people. And we're all leaders, even if you're in a small space of people, we all can change the perspective in the face of HIV and AIDS. And like I said, a lot of it is not about disclosing your status. When you hear something, they have the saying, when you see something, say something. Well, when you hear something, say something. When you hear people passing out wrong information or talking negatively about people living with HIV, chime in and educate that person. It doesn't mean that you have to disclose your status, but you're doing a little piece of something. And we all fit into a little puzzle when it comes to changing this. So Tammy, back to you.
Thank you so much for sharing about Sankofa and your healing weekends. That just sound amazing, along with the Ohio Health Modernization Movement. And I shared the link to join Ohio Health Modernization Movement, OHMM, if you are not a member already. And
I want to say one little thing. If you're still on the fence about this, go to our website. Watch, we have a lot of information. We've got a lot of webinars and educational sessions where you'll see people living with HIV, because that's the most important thing that HINAC has taught me, that people living with HIV have to be in the forefront. We must be in the forefront. We shouldn't have to ask permission to do this work that impacts our lives. So HINAC, which stands for HIV is not a crime training, has gave me the confidence and has made me realize that I'm going to constantly fight for people living with HIV to have a place at the table. And if you don't give us a seat at the table, we're going to sit on the damn table, or we're going to bring our own, or we can stand and still do the work that we do. So thanks to HINAC for making me realize that people living with HIV have to be at the forefront of this movement. It gives us confidence. It makes us realize that we can fight our own battle, and we fight our best fight together as opposed to by yourself.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Bryan. Next slide, please, Cindy. And this is a question and answer. And I want to share, Julie typed in a question in the chat box. She says, and I agree with her completely, thank you so much for your courage to speak on the panel today. Really appreciate it. The question is, I think there is a perception in medical and HIV services that people living with HIV know about the laws because providers assume that folks have been told by somebody else. What would you like to say about that? Did any of you ever have a conversation with your medical providers, testers, or case managers about these laws? And did they initiate those conversations?
Well,
Tony, yeah.
I want to give Siyahni and Tony a chance to comment on this, because it's important to hear both of y'all's perspectives on this.
Since being diagnosed in 1992, I have never been confronted with anything about HIV laws. Never knew anything about it. No one has ever said anything about it.
Thank you, Tony.
Me neither.
And for these laws, they are, at one point, they had to get you to sign off on them having a conversation about these laws. Now they have to put it in the case notes to receive funding. And sometimes I call the place where I get my care from a temporary center, because each time I go to get my update from Ryan White, I have a different case manager. And somebody needs to start paying me for educating these case managers each time I go about these laws. And they tell us that you have to disclose XYZ. They tell us all these things you have to do, but they fail to share that we have rights too. If detained or being withheld, don't share your HIV status. Don't agree to have an HIV test. Ask for a lawyer immediately. These are things that people living with HIV need to know about. So if you're going to tell me that it's a felony not to disclose, give me tools that help me if I'm detained or stopped or harassed in this space. And so that's the important part. And you have many people who are case managers and who are medical people who feel that we shouldn't be having sex because we have implicit biases by all these people, which is biases that people have developed over the years by the information that they receive. And they don't realize that they're being biased towards us. And they are biased. I have faced stigma more so in the medical space than I have in any other space. I had my doctor say, "Oh, Mr. Jones, your numbers look great. Your cholesterol is great, and XYZ is great, but you're HIV." And I'm like, "Why are we whispering? I'm in a clinic that's HIV specific clinic, and you're whispering to me about HIV, which is sending me either a conscious or unconscious message that my diagnosis should be a secret and it's something that I should be ashamed of, or I don't use the word disclosure because disclosure is a stigmatizing word. The definition of disclosure is new or secret information, and your diagnosis should not be a secret. It should empower you because your diagnosis is yours to share. And that's one thing HINAC has told me, that there's no shame in being a person living with HIV. They drum that point home all the time. I don't care wherever you go at HINAC, you can go outside and smoke a cigarette. Somebody's constantly telling you there is no shame in being a person living with HIV. And that's what I loved about attending these trainings.
Thank you, Bryan. And I think, and Julie, thank you so much for that question. I think it highlights the importance of one of these conversations, but how the system is failing us. So 30 plus years ago, 31 years ago, Tony was not told about these laws. 3 years ago, Siyahni still in 2020 was not informed about these laws. So people are being put at risk by people who should be informing us after our diagnosis, and not necessarily on the day that we are tested or receive our diagnosis, because that's once you receive your diagnosis, sometimes you shut down and you don't receive the information, the paper that you were talking about, Bryan, back in the day that we had to sign. I mean, at that point,
it's the Charlie Brown syndrome. When they tell you have a diagnosis, all you hear is wah, 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 wah. And then they're forcing you to sign this paper to send this. It's just too much. And people, and we've seen people who have taken their lives because they get this overload of information and they immediately feel like there's shame and guilt and all these other things that we can't figure out. And we're not given a chance to figure it out. So sorry about that, Jamie.
No, thank you. That the Charlie Brown syndrome, that is a great way to visualize what people hear. But, you know, we're also at that time told we can get you into care and services, but you need to sign this paper. You need to sign this paper. And so you're signing papers thinking that you're going to get the care and services that you need, but we're giving them, you know, providing evidence in case somebody threatened to say that you hadn't disclosed your status. So it's definitely a problem that we need to figure out with case managers, with doctors, testers, to make sure that people are aware of what, not just the medical care that they need moving forward after a diagnosis, but how to protect themselves legally so that they don't get caught up in the criminal injustice system. Bryan, did you have a thought?
Yeah, I think the gist of it is, we assume that just because someone tells you have an HIV diagnosis, that you understand what that means. These criminalization laws also say that the person you disclose to has to be able to understand what disclosure means, meaning those people who may have mental health. It protects that person, but it does not protect the person who's doing the disclosure, because we know that mental health and HIV can sometimes go hand in hand. And we have to understand that there is trauma around receiving a diagnosis. It may not be a clinically diagnosed mental health situation, but there is some things that take you out of your sane self. And we assume that just because someone told you you have HIV, that you understand what disclosure means and how should I disclose. Because a lot of times with me, as an example, I couldn't tell myself that I had this diagnosis. And it's almost like, I always say this, like being a child all over again, learning how to walk again. We assume that people know how to disclose in these spaces. We've got to understand that when we disclose or share our status with people, it can be danger with that diagnosis. And so people don't necessarily understand how the government doesn't understand how much we put ourselves at risk when you're requiring us to do something that could be detrimental to our health. And you can look at in Texas. I always keep saying Texas because people have been murdered for sharing their diagnosis. And also, these laws also keep us in abusive relationships, particularly women in abusive relationships, where they disclose or share the status with their partner, and they say, if you go somewhere else, if you think you're going to leave me in this relationship, I'm going to go to the police and tell them you didn't diagnose. And we've seen perfect examples of this, where people live with someone who kept their medication in the medicine cabinet that they shared with somebody, and they still said that this person didn't disclose to them. So.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Bryan. Now, in closing, I want to ask all three of you to please give one tip or advice for participants to take home with them. If it's from HINAC, if it's from advocacy, or anything else that you're feeling, just some advice for everyone to take with them. So can I call on you first, Tony?
One thing I'd say is be true about your status. And hey, don't be ashamed. It's okay to be living with HIV.
Thank you. Thank you, Tony. Siyahni, as a new advocate, what advice could you provide for people who are listening?
I don't want to sound like I'm repeating, but I was going to say the same thing. Like, it's okay. Like how Bryan was saying earlier about the young people teaching him about you can share it through my chart. I do that. I disclose my information to my partners, my family, because I'm not ashamed of it. I'm not ashamed of it at all. It's a piece of who I am, but it's not all of who I am. I'm multiple pieces. I'm not just my status. That's just a small piece of me. So it's okay to be aware. It's okay to be strong in it, and it's okay to be out and proud about it. I mean, it's the same thing. Like if I'm also trans, I'm out and proud about that. So be proud of yourself.
Thank you, Siyahni. That's beautiful. HIV is just a part of who we are. It is not who we are. Thank you so much for sharing that. And Bryan.
Well, you know, I have two things to share. What helped me gain confidence is I stopped letting other people's shit be my shit. Meaning, if you can't accept that part of me of being a person living with, then that's your thing. I'm responsible for telling it, but I'm not responsible for how you receive it. And I also say that everyone should be HIV positive. And I know y'all saying, what did that fool just say? But not from a perspective, but from not from a diagnosis or a blood test, but from a perspective. Positive about helping us eradicate this virus, positive about helping to make the space safe for people to receive treatment and for people to get tested. And so we all should be HIV positive, or a person living with HIV, because if one of us have it, we all have it. And if one of us is prosecuted, it's only a matter of time before you'll be prosecuted around something else that you don't think impact you. HIV doesn't become important, like the theme of HINAC is you care about criminalization laws, you just don't know it yet. And it may be on your door. You don't care about it till it's on your doorstep. But think about this, it may be sleeping next to you and you don't realize it. So HIV impacts us all.
Thank you. That is so powerful, Bryan. Thank you so much. Cindy, can you go to the next slide, please? So again, we want to thank the AIDS Funding Collaborative for funding this project and for funding people from Ohio, especially Cuyahoga County, to attend HINAC. I think we've proven the importance of trainings and education, and the fact that Bryan and Tony are bringing that information home. And Siyahni, we hope that we can see you at HINAC 6. But funding to bring people is so important, along with having conversations like this. So thank you so much. And the next slide, we want to offer some resources. So the SARO Project, also Health Not Prisons Collective, CHLP, the Center for HIV Law and Policy, who created the map along with other policy papers and other things for state coalitions. So please look them up as well. Positive Women's Network and the U.S. People Living with HIV Caucus. As people living with HIV, it's important to get engaged with these different organizations that are led by people living with HIV, to get involved, to learn about different opportunities. So I want to give a special thanks to Bryan, Tony, and Siyahni for sharing your experiences and advice with us tonight. You were fantastic, and I appreciate you so much. And with that, we'll wish everyone a great night. Thank you, Julie. Also, HIV Justice Worldwide. .org. There is a specific training module that HIV Justice Worldwide has created, based a lot on the work that was done at HINAC, also our Sero Project Justice Institute, and different things, that there are many resources. So thank you for sharing that as well, Julie.